Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, episode 15. On this week's episode, I talk about the hot button topic of gentrification. I talk about what it is, what I think its kind of types are, and the future of it. So stay tuned. Hello, everyone! Welcome to the Know Your Place podcast. It's Charles Aldendorf again. So this week we're talking about gentrification, and it's a topic that, has been around geography and urban planning circles for probably at least 2, maybe 3 decades, probably even 4 or 5 now. But I think it's one that's finally very much in the public consciousness now. Like, I think if I said that term, a half of my listeners would know what it is, even if they're not geographic experts or urban planners. So I'm excited to talk about it today. Gentrification, for those of you who don't know, or let's sort of define it. The Wikipedia definition is pretty good here. It says it's a process of renovation of deteriorated urban neighborhoods by the means of influx of more affluent residents. And it says it's a controversial topic. Well, I will have to take a little umbrage with necessarily just saying more affluent. Yes, I mean, obviously that's true that they fix these places up and they become more expensive. But generally, when gentrification originally starts to happen, it's not necessarily poor people, or it's not necessarily just some rich people that come in. You'll often see entrepreneurs, in my opinion, come in. People, risk takers. A good example is in where I'm living right now, or where I'm staying right now, Bloomington, Indiana. There's a cupcake. There's a bakery there. It's a very special kind of bakery, and they basically took over what looks like an old warehouse storefront or something and turned it into a bakery, and they got, a bunch of stuff from the 60s, real kitschy stuff, right? To me, that's also a kind of gentrification, right? Because that building was, relatively abandoned before, right? But those people who started that business weren't just some rich people, right? I mean, they had to get a loan from a bank, and the bank probably approved it because it said, well, we're not making, nobody's making money on the property anyway, and sure, it'll probably work out, this bakery idea you have. And, we like having small businesses in this town. But it's, so to just say it's just some rich people that moved in isn't necessarily true. It starts on a very basic entrepreneurial level. Now, as an area improves and people like being around said bakery or whatever and move into the area, yes, generally speaking, then land values rise and it becomes more rich people live there. So I take a little umbrage with the definition. I think it oversimplifies it a bit. But, I'm just waxing on geographic and urban planner here on my own podcast. So I'm going to come in with I'd like to take this to a whole nother level, though. I think something that's not really discussed much about gentrification, because it's such a broad term, right? What does it mean to fix up an area, right? I want to break it out into 3 sort of categories to make it simpler for people. And these are my own categories. I'd say you have sort of a huge overarching plan that's a macro gentrification plan. And you actually largely don't see those anymore. There were attempts to do those sorts of things at different points in time, and they still crop up from time to time. But I'd say you largely don't see them anymore because they largely they fail over time. You can see lots of examples of them, of these sorts of endeavors where a city says we're gonna rezone this whole block and we're gonna rezone this whole neighborhood, and all of a sudden it's gonna be nicer, right? And what inevitably happens is it doesn't work. At least that's my opinion. I could be wrong. We'll see if some of the other listeners take umbrage with what I'm saying. And then you have sort of a medium-sized one where that's like a block gets redeveloped, and that to me are usually the most successful ones, uh, because uh, you're having a change on your whole block, but you're not trying too hard to force a top-down rule on it. Because once you really get too much into the top-down and the city throws too much money into it, I think it just gets, it's almost like it puts too much pressure on the development. Like it has to succeed. Oh no! And then when it doesn't, everybody freaks out. So that's how I generally feel about that. And then there's the minor level, which is sort of like what I was talking about in the beginning, where you just develop one little corner, or a couple buildings, but you don't do like a whole block, or anything like that. Anyway, I'm going to give better examples of these. I probably should have put this up differently, but we'll go into deeper examples. So a macro development that's still sort of in the works and is reasonably successful, although you're going to hear a lot of criticisms, is what's been going on in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. In lots of areas in the Ninth Ward, not so much in the lower Ninth Ward, but in the Ninth Ward and some areas along the lakefront, there's been a massive redevelopment corporation sort of plan, especially in the Ninth Ward. I've heard of it. But anyway, and the whole thing's being redeveloped, and a bunch of people are moving in. They're building all these new structures, and they're laying them out with all the latest urban trimmings, to try and make it all green and the type of thing that attracts a certain type of clientele. And so that's a macro example, just because I don't, the Ninth Ward. I forget how many blocks it is exactly, but it's a large area we're talking about. We're not talking about some even like just a couple blocks of a neighborhood. No, we're talking about like a square mile or so. The next thing I want to talk about is what I consider the medium size, and I'm going to use this little example of where I went to college in Lexington, Kentucky. So there's this main street, or one of the main streets that runs next to campus is called Limestone Street. And they made a big thing about redeveloping it, and we are only talking about a 2 or 3 block stretch. They said we're gonna upgrade the street a little, and they actually took out a lane of cars and put in a bike lane and more parking and eco-friendly drains, and it looks reasonably nice what they did. And one of the developments in there that I think is really interesting is, part of the problem, the reason why gentrification often stalls is people want to save historic structures, but when they're 100 years old, that's not very easy to do, right? I mean, like, you can't buy most of the stuff that's in these buildings anymore. They're definitely not up to modern codes. They're not handicap accessible or anything like that. So, what they decided to do on this street, which I just found the most fascinating thing I've ever seen, they kept the facades of the old buildings. So when you're looking at it from the street, it still looks like these buildings are the same buildings that were there in 1900. But behind them, they built loft apartments with totally modern stuff in them. So, when you get in them, it's a totally modern space. But when you look out front, it's the facades. And I think that's actually a really cool idea. I think that's pretty innovative. And they did it on this one long block, so it looks very uniform and nice. Anyway, so that's and then the minor development in this, I would say, would be or the micro. I saw on an episode of House Hunters. I don't know how many times this show is going to come up on my podcast, but there was one where this couple was looking for somewhere to live in St. Louis, and they couldn't figure out where they wanted to live, right? So what did they do? They bought an old warehouse building and they converted it into some kind of small business. Now, they didn't do anything to the neighborhood around them, okay? It was just this building, right? and their business started functioning. Believe it or not, I didn't think it was going to go off. I thought for sure they were going to flounder because they seemed kind of flighty people, and I didn't really think they had a good business plan. But it worked. Their business was successful. It took off. In fact, you can still look it up on Google Maps. I'll have to look up what it was again. Well, you could like 5 years ago, so maybe this is out of date. But so right, you can have a successful business, but that neighborhood around them, I mean, it hasn't changed much. It still doesn't look much different. But maybe it will over time because their business is successful. Okay, so now that I've given you a very strong depth of what I would call gentrification, I want to talk about its consequences. I could go on forever and ever giving you examples, but what do I think the consequences of this of gentrification are? Well, I would say macro plans. Again, I started talking about these in the beginning. I just see them largely as negative. I and this goes sort of back to my life philosophy, because I don't think you can force people to live anywhere. Now, that being said, people who go and join along with these macro plans are choosing to voluntarily. But, they're trying to design to attract a certain type of people, and I'm just not sure that really takes the organic out of the development, right? And that's not really how cities work. They don't. I mean, yes, they do develop with plans, and I am not saying there's no room for urban planning, but when you get to the point that you're like, oh, hey, here's our master gentrification scheme, and we're only going to have people of this much income. Well, how many people of that much income exist around your city? So then what's going to happen to everywhere around it? Or, usually those people are interdispersed throughout your city. So is every neighborhood then outside of your newly gentrified neighborhood going to collapse? I mean, it's this kind of stuff that nobody talks about, when they bust out all these pretty architectural designs and they say that, this is it, this is the new area, this is the whole, So, that's, and then that's not even to mention the fact, if you do pull it off, and you do manage to gentrify an area, and you make it so pricey that no people from other incomes can live there, then the poorest people, they don't stay there, because they can't afford to. Well, suddenly they moved everywhere else, and again, that's what I'm talking about. Then all of a sudden, you're stratifying your community, and I'm just not sure that's very healthy. Ideally, what I think every neighborhood should have is, a decent amount of middle class people with some people on one end and some people on the other end. That is what I think makes a strong city and a strong economy in general. But, I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of flack and people in the comments section. So, anyway, that's what I think of that. So, I don't think macro plans are largely effective, and I think they're I think mainly they're a way that you get hoodwinked a bit as the taxpayer. You're being told that this plan's going to work and it's the new hottest thing, and then you find out 5 years later that your city's swimming in debt and the plan didn't really work that well. So, yeah. Now, medium level ones I think are absolutely great. Like I talked about that one in Lexington. If you're doing a couple blocks and they get together and they decide that that's what they want to do, or like my parents are from Port Washington, Wisconsin, and a bunch of businesses along the harbor front just sort of gave this area to the city to allow it to become a harbor walk. Well, the city didn't spend a lot of money in the beginning, right? It was all just area right next to these that these people said, yeah, sure, you can make it part of your harbor walk. And it's great, right? It's a great little walk along the harbor, and, now the city just maintains it. And that, to me, that kind of stuff is just great. And I guess some of it's considered not necessarily gentrification, but it is, right? You're taking stuff that's somewhat blighted and you're making a way to make it look nicer, make it look better. So that's what I like. I like it when, like I said, areas of a couple blocks get together and they make a plan and they say, hey, this is what we want to do, and we think this will make our place a spot. And I think those are always the most successful. Now, on the micro level, eh, in America, I'm not sure how strict some of the laws are in our foreign countries here, but in America, you can buy land anywhere, right? Now, some people say there's some limitations on that, and there are. You may not get credit extended to you on certain things, if especially depending upon your credit score. But largely, you can set up shop anywhere. So if you've decided that you have your heart set on this old warehouse building, and you say, I want to turn this into a loft space with an urban garden, largely you can do it without somebody stopping you, right? But will that change the community around you? Well, not necessarily, right? Like, if people around you don't buy into what you're doing, no, it's not going to. You can't just operate on an island and expect everybody else to respect what you're doing. If we give sort of a counterexample, I gave you some successful examples of development and things. I've heard a lot of people say they've tried to open up new businesses and set up shop in different parts of Baltimore, and it's failed. I watched a very long documentary about that. I may link in the comments section, but they say every time we try and do something to clean up in the area, it fails. And that's part of the problem, right? How do you get the identity with the place? And that's how you help gentrification. And I will post below on this feed, or on this episode, a great link, one of my favorite lectures of all time that I just stumbled across. And it's talking about calling somewhere a culture city, and how you take a point where it's an emphasis or a focal point in the city, and you try and make that, you try and help that area flourish, and then it sort of expands out to the rest of the city, and it really gives everybody something to cheer for. And I thought it was an absolutely great lecture. It's in 5 parts. It's about an hour. But I thought it was very fascinating. So anyway, and the funniest part of it was, she said the worst problem we had was there was a bunch of people sitting in their planners' offices that never talked to the people in the community about what they wanted their place to look like. And I thought that was great. I wish I had that recorded and I could play that back to everyone who makes a plan all the time. Any kind of plan, small or large. Okay. So now that I've talked your ear off about sort of the macro, the micro, and the medium, I guess we need to talk about what do I think the future is of gentrification in America. And I think the jury's out. I don't know. I would say we had a boom of gentrification in the past decade. People moving. They say the millennial generation moved back into the urban centers at a rate much faster than anyone before. You see all kinds of stuff all over the internet about somebody starting some small business. Typical people. Should I use the hipster word? Starting a business. And it's been interesting. There are net positives of that, right? Some places have gotten better because of that. But the question you have to ask yourself is as these people do grow up, as they do start families, as more millennials are starting families now, finally, are they going to want to live that way? Are they going to want to live in I have my loft space above my restaurant, surrounded by some area that, it's still pretty hoodlum, or, I sometimes just have stuff stolen out the back of my shop, but I deal with it because I want to be part of the urban revitalization project. Priorities change when, you have children or you have any kind of life changes, or as you get older, and they just get tired. Well, they want to keep continually dealing with that when they're 50 years old, or will they say, I want to instead live in a suburban environment? I don't know. I don't know what will happen with that. If I had to venture to guess, I would say it's a trend, but I don't know when the trend's going to end. I guess if I had a crystal ball, I would say it's just going to slowly start petering out. You're going to see less and less of these independent places popping up in once blighted areas and doing well. And you can already kind of see this to a degree. I saw an article that came out like 5 years ago from, I don't know if it was Forbes or it was some business website, and basically it said that the margin in these new style American restaurants is really tight, and it did some percentage of them, and it showed how like even there'd be restaurants that would be successful for like the first 3 years, like wildly successful, and then have to close after 5 years because they couldn't maintain it. And I think that's going to happen with a lot of these businesses, is that, the boom has hit and now we're going to see the slow bust. But it's still good. I'm glad to have seen it. I'm glad to have been around for this boom. It's been very cool seeing all these little independent businesses and seeing the creativity that some people have. And I hope some of them do last. I hope I can still come back to some places like, some of the nice local restaurants I used to go to in Lexington, or, this bakery here in Bloomington. So, anyway, let me know what you all think in the comments section, and thanks. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.